Sugar changed the world. It is early morning on a Caribbean island, and African slaves, hundreds of them, are being sent out to the fields to pull weeds and burn the high, dry grass. Bent over, palms calloused from the small, tough stalks, smoke scorching their eyes, they work. The overseer prowls nearby, mounted on horseback, a rawhide whip fastened to his saddle. The plants that Columbus brought with him to the island he called Hispaniola, now Haiti and the Dominican Republic, flourished. Soon there were sugar plantations all over the island, and a kind of white gold rush began. More and more Europeans saw growing sugar in the New World with slave labor as the road to vast wealth. In just over 100 years, between 1701 and 1810, 252,500 enslaved Africans were brought to Barbados, an island that occupies only 166 square miles, making it today one of the smallest countries in the world. The English then set out to conquer more sugar islands, starting with Jamaica, which they took from Spain in 1665. In the same period that the 252,500 Africans were brought to Barbados, 400 Africans were taken to Jamaica. Thus, sugar drove more than 900,000 people into slavery across the Atlantic to Barbados and Jamaica, and these were just two of the sugar islands. The English were eagerly filling Antigua, Nevis, St. Kitts, and Montserrat with slaves and sugar mills. They took over much of Dutch Guiana for the same reason. Seeing the fortunes being made in sugar, the French started their own scramble to turn the half of the island of Hispaniola that they controlled, which is now Haiti, as well as Martinique, Guadeloupe, and French Guiana along the South American coast near Dutch Guiana into their own sugar colonies, which were filled with hundreds and thousands more African slaves. By 1753, British ships were taking average of 34,250 slaves from Africa every year. And by 1768, that number had reached to 53,100. The sugar that piled up on the docks near the plantations was something new in the world. Pure sweetness, pure pleasure, so cheap that common people could afford it. Scientists have shown that people all over the world must learn to like salty taste, sour taste, mixed taste, but from the moment we are born, we crave sweetness. Cane sugar was the first product in human history that perfectly satisfied that desire. And the bitter lives of the enslaved Africans produced so much sugar that pure sweetness began to spread around the world. Between the 1600s and the 1800s, sugar drove the entire economy, linking Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The true age of sugar had begun, and it was doing more to reshape the world than any ruler, empire, or war had ever done. Cutting cane was hard work, but it was nothing like what came next. Piles of freshly cut cane had to be fed into the ever-turning mill wheels until they were completely crushed. The owners insisted that during the work hours, the grinding never stopped, no matter what. The mills were most often tended by women who were doing dangerous work while getting almost no rest. That was a very bad combination. An axe was often propped up near the rollers, so if a slave closed her eyes for a second while pushing the cane, her arm could be hacked off before she was pulled through the merciless grinders. Guests at sugar plantations often remarked on how many one-armed people they saw. To understand the slavery that brought Africans to the New World, you must begin with the death rate on the sugar plantations. Though we often think of slavery as a problem peculiar to the United States, only 4% of the slaves taken from Africa were brought to North America, which means that 96% went to the Caribbean, Brazil, and the rest of South America, mostly to work with sugar. The slave population in North America grew over time as parents lived long enough to have children. Some 500,000 slaves were brought here, and there were 4 million enslaved African Americans at the time of emancipation. But on the Sugar Islands, while more than 2 million people were brought over from Africa, there were only 670,000 at emancipation. Sugar, with its demand for relentless labor, was a killer. All this death, all this cruelty, all this abuse was for one purpose: to produce white gold. From the 1750s on, sugar transformed how Europeans ate. Chefs who served the wealthy began to divide meals up. Where sugar had previously been used either as decoration, as in the wedding feast, or as a spice to flavor all courses, now it was removed from recipes for meat, fish, and vegetables and given its own place in desserts. Dessert was the extremely sweet end to the meal, was invented because so much sugar was available. But the wealthy were not the only ones whose meals were changing. Sugar became a food, a necessity, and the foundation of the diet for England's poorest workers. In 1800, when the English were consuming their 18 pounds of sugar a year, around 250,000 tons of sugar was produced worldwide, almost all sent to Europe. A century later, in 1900, when sugar was used in jams, cakes, syrups, and tea, and every modern country was filled with factories, world production of sugar reached 6 million tons. By that time, the average person in England ate 90 pounds of sugar a year. And in the early 20th century, that number kept rising. Americans today eat only about 40 pounds of cane sugar a year, but that is because other forms of sweeteners, such as corn syrup, are now cheaper than cane sugar. If you consider all forms of sweetener, Americans eat an average of 140 pounds every year.